Hello friends. Welcome to the Eastern Front channel. Today we will talk with you about the memoirs of Friedrich Paulus Adjutant, Arno von Lenski, who fought with Paulus until he was captured in 1943. The armies of the Allies, as already mentioned, the 6th Army was to screen the northern flank of the Panzer armies thrusting forward to the Volga. Order number 41 of the June 23, 1942 gave it the new task of taking Stalingrad in cooperation with the 4th Panzer Army. As flank protection in the area from Kletskaya to north of Koratoyak, the Allied armies were deployed in order from the west: the Hungarian 2nd Army, the Italian 8th Army and the Romanian 3rd Army. What did we want from the Allied armies? We knew that they had been formed into independent army formations shortly before the 1942 summer offensive had begun. Only a small part of the newly formed armies in the rear area of Army Group South, with effect from the July 7, 1942 Army Group B, had combat experience. Equipment and weapons were in short supply. In view of this, the Romanians and Hungarians were advised completely, the Italians partly, to turn to the German armaments industry. How does it help if, when push comes to shove, the northern flank has the strongest anti-tank weapons and the Allied armies are totally lacking in heavy tank-busting weapons and heavy artillery? For example, the Romanian Tank Division was equipped only with captured light Czech and French tanks. In comparison to the German divisions, the fighting strength of our allies amounted to only 50 or 60%. Clearly, in view of their insufficient armament and equipment, these armies could never withstand an attack by an enemy equipped with T-34 tanks, but this applied not only to their weapons, it applied even more to the soldiers using them. Romanian divisions since 1941 had proved successful in the aggressive fighting in the southern sector. The soldiers were brave, disciplined and unassuming, being mostly farmers. As long as they were still fighting near their home boundaries, the war had had some sense for them. Then one or another had been tempted by the soil in Bessarabia, or in the territory between the Dnestr and the Bug, which Hitler had promised to Marshal Antonescu as Transnistrian. Perhaps one could be a free farmer there. This was not possible in the old Romania of the great landowners, but what was the Romanian farmer soldier doing between the Don and the Volga? Then there were the unbelievable conditions in the Romanian army, such as corporal punishment. My friend Otto Roll told me that he himself had once seen a Romanian soldier beaten and mistreated by an officer. Such things did not raise the fighting morale of the Romanians, and this showed particularly when the going was hard. General Paulus regarded the Romanians highly, and also had confidence in the Hungarians, but he had fought against the Italians in the First World War, and knew them too from an inspection that he had carried out as senior quartermaster of the army headquarters in North Africa. He took it as being especially necessary to place them within the strong corsets of German divisions. The fighting morale of the Italians was certainly influenced by their living even further away from the Soviet Union than the Romanians and Hungarians. If it was 1,500 kilometers from Bucharest to the Volga, and 1,900 from Budapest, the Romans and Milanese were fighting almost 3,000 kilometers from their homeland. Fighting for what? For Greater Germany? It was quite understandable that they should have little liking for it. The ways and means adopted by the German High Command to deal with the weaknesses of their allies only strengthened their mistrust. As already said, our allies were almost totally dependent upon Germany for their heavy weapons and a large part of their equipment. In fact, they received little enough. Therefore, it was firmly stated in Order Number 41, for occupying the more and more extending Don front in the course of this operation, the Allies' units will be in the first line to be called upon, with the stipulation that German troops are to be inserted as strong supports between the Ural and the Don as well as the Stalingrad Isthmus, the rest of the individual German divisions remaining available as front attack reserves. All this contributed to the Allies slowly taking up their sectors. The Hungarian 2nd Army, which had carried out the attack on Voronezh, took over the securing of Donau as far as Novaya Kalitva in conjunction with the German 2nd Army. At the end of July and the beginning of August, the Italian 8th Army replaced those infantry divisions of the 6th Army in the area from Boguchar to Kletskaya that were urgently needed for the attack on the Kalach bridgehead. The German XVIth Corps came under the Italian 8th Army. The Romanian 3rd Army was now on its way, the Italian troops temporarily having to take over the area allocated to them. Widely separated from each other, the inadequately armed and ill-equipped allies now stood on the Don. There were insufficient forces to construct a continuous position. This was no defensive front, rather only a thin security line. this could not remain concealed from the very active enemy. No wonder that the army headquarters looked anxiously to the north. Should the Russians take advantage of the weakness in our deep flank, we will be in a more than unpleasant situation, Adam. Look at how the front runs. It is like a clenched fist, really devilishly unpleasant, General. The enemy only now needs to apply the scalpel to the wrist and the fist is off. Let's hope that Schmundt is presenting a true picture of the situation at Führer headquarters. We told him clearly enough. Let us hope further that our allies get the heavy weapons they lack. The coming weeks would bring us the most bitter disappointment for all our hopes. The battle at Kalisz. For days, the Luftwaffe had been reporting that the Russians were reinforcing their bridgehead west of Kalisz. The effects were next detected by the List Corps. Its regiments got a bloody nose when they attacked the Soviet bridgehead east of Surovkino. Meanwhile, however, some of our divisions had been replaced by the Italian 8th Army and moved into their temporary areas. Infantry divisions took over the northern bank of the Don from Ostrovsky to Kletskaya in the sector occupied by the XIVTH Panzer Corps, enabling the panzers to move into the attack north of Kamensky. During the first days of August, the 76th and 295th Infantry Divisions, which had come under the 17th Army until then, were brought forward to reinforce the 6th Army's right flank. On the August 6th, the preparations for the big blow against the Soviet bastion were completed. Our units had taken up their launching positions and were supplied with sufficient ammunition and fuel. According to the reports, lying before us on the enemy side were 12 rifle divisions and 5 tank brigades. Their line of retreat across the Don had to be blocked. They were to be surrounded and destroyed. The operational plan allocated both Panzer Corps the task of erecting a barrier on the Don. The XIVTH Panzer Corps had to thrust forward from the Kamensky area to the Don, the XXIVTH Panzer Corps from the Nizhny Cherskaya area to the Don. Early on the August 7th, the earth groaned under the weight of the tanks rattling forward. The morning silence was suddenly broken by the exploding of shells and torn by the whipping of the belts of machine gun fire. Our tanks were able to break through the Soviet defensive positions. The spearheads of the two attacking corps met within a few hours. Then, however, the real fighting began. Our attacking infantry divisions struck a skillful and bitterly resilient enemy, who had immediately recognized the threatening danger from the German tanks and, fighting with their backs to the Don, counterattacked the Panzer Corps. The latter fired whatever was in their gun barrels. Nevertheless, elements of the Red Army were able to cross over to the east bank of the Don. After 4 days of hard fighting, the battle was over. A great German victory was proclaimed with blasts of fanfares. It did not mention that we had to pay a high cost in men and material, or certainly the enemy losses were still larger, but left on the Kalisz battlefield were numerous burnt out or shot up German tanks, and this was especially bad news for us, for our homeland was more than 2,000 kilometers away, making it difficult to bring up replacements. Above all, the Red Army won valuable time for the construction of a new defensive front between the Volga and the Don on the approach to Stalingrad. It was able to stop the 4th Panzer Army, which had already come out of the Zimlianskaya area through the Kalmuk steppe to Stalingrad south on the August 1st. In order to improve its penetrating strength, the 6th Army had to give up the 24th Panzer Division and the 297th Infantry Division to the 4th Panzer Army on the instructions of the Army High Command. Both these divisions crossed the Don on a military bridge near Potemkinskaya. To make best use of the success achieved at Kalisz, the 6th Army should have immediately continued the attack over the Don. But it was not in a position to do so. Again, valuable time was lost. The units had to be reorganized, the lost weapons and equipment replaced, ammunition and fuel replenished. Growing losses and sinking morale, I saw the casualty reports that had been prepared in writing by the divisions. I went myself to those that had suffered the most. Among them was the 376th Infantry Division, commanded by Lieutenant General Edler von Daniels. At the conclusion of the fighting, it stood together with the 384th and 44th Infantry Divisions in the Don bend east of Kletskaya. The three divisions had had the task of throwing the Red Army back over the river. This goal was achieved, but subsequently several Soviet units were able to cross back over the Don at various points and establish bridgeheads. In this fighting too, our troops had to suffer a heavy toll. Consequently, many companies of the 376th Infantry Division had a fighting strength of only 25 men. Things were a little better in the 44th and 384th Infantry Divisions, but companies with fighting strengths of between 35 and 40 men gave no cause for optimism. As the Sixth Army approached the Volga, the streams flowed with German blood. The cheap successes of the Western campaign were long since past. Gone too was the carefree military atmosphere of the summer of 1941, and the months of May and June 1942. In my journeys in my cross-country jeep, I kept coming across stragglers looking for their units after some hard fighting. I especially remember 2 soldiers who had taken part in the battle near Kalisz. They belonged to a division that I was looking for. I took them with me. Still full of fresh impressions of the battle they had experienced, the corporal sitting behind me recounted, "I had never smoked so much since I had been in the East. Ivan gave us such a blistering that one could lose one's hearing and eyesight. Fortunately we had dug ourselves in deeply or nothing would have remained of us. All watch out for the Russian artillery, which operates en masse. Their hits detonated only a hair's breadth from our position. One could only pull in one's head and stick it in the dirt. Many of us were wiped out. We cursed the Stalin organs most of all. Where they landed it was too late for most to make their wills." His comrade, who, I learnt in the course of the conversation, had been deprived of his arbiter school certificate by being called up, added, "And how their infantry attacked. Their would soon have driven me mad. Only their guts and indifference to death brings them on." Is it really only the commissars that make them do it, standing behind them with a pistol? I have the hollow feeling that there are things about the Russians that we know nothing about. The corporal went one step further than his comrade. He turned directly to me. 3 weeks ago, our company commander told us that the Red Army was completely wiped out, that soon we would be able to relax in Stalingrad. That doesn't seem to be happening. On the July 31st they annoyed us more than a bit. Only at the last minute were our artillery and anti-tank guns able to stop the Russian counterattack. Will this not end soon, Colonel, sir? Asked the young soldier. It was noticeable that the course of the war was important to him. Perhaps only 6 months ago he had been singing at school, "Today Germany belongs to us, tomorrow the whole world." This exuberance had flown away for the moment. Both of them awaited a response from me. I turned round to them. "I am no prophet, therefore cannot prophesy, but the war will not come to an end so soon. You have yourselves sensed that the Russians are now hitting back. Now we first have to take Stalingrad, and then we will be able to see further ahead." How is the mood in your company? What can one say, Colonel, sir, said the corporal. You will not be angry with me if I speak openly? The war has already gone on too long. Our older ones are longing to get back home. The letters coming from there are discouraging too. The wife of a farmer who had had a lot of trouble with a prisoner of war wrote that she no longer knew what to do to get the work done properly. In the towns, especially among the workers' families, food is getting ever shorter. The women no longer know what to do to fill the hungry stomachs of their children. That depresses the spirits. The high losses are also not without effect. When we marched across the battlefield on the August 11th and saw the many dead and wounded, my mate said so that everyone could hear him, "We will all perish on this damned, uncomfortable step. He is a good and brave soldier. He got the Iron Cross first class already last autumn." I was thinking over what I had just heard when the vehicle stopped. We had reached the divisional headquarters. With a thank you and a smart salute, the two soldiers excused themselves. So that was how it was in their company. The older ones longed for home and the younger ones had already had enough. Was it the same in the other companies? Once I had obtained a personal picture of the fighting strengths of the divisions, I reported to the Chief of Staff. Major General Schmidt was not surprised. He knew how hard the fighting had been in the last days. He gave his opinion. The question of replacements is a burning one. Take all possible steps immediately with the subordinate commands. But report to General Paulus first. He has been going round the divisions all day and can surely give you further instructions. Paulus received me with the words, "Now, Adam, how is it with the divisions? I now have an apparently clear idea. It is pleasing that many of those taken to be missing have found their way back to their units. Also a number of the lightly wounded have been sent back to their units after brief treatment by the first aid posts. But what significance does this have when the fighting strength of the companies is down to about 30 or 40 men? We have paid a high price for our success. The hard fighting and the heavy losses are getting on the soldiers' nerves. There is widespread depression. I share Major General Schmidt's view that the subordinate commands must receive replacements as soon as possible. I agree with your assessment and proposed measures completely. All the commanders that I have spoken to in the last few days regard replacements as the most important issue. The Russian bridgehead near Kalisz was a hard nut for us to crack. Our divisions must be filled immediately. Use the teleprinter and state the demands. While I was talking to Paulus, My deputy had been putting together the replacement requests, but the teleprinter to the commands back home had been removed. That night I spoke by telephone with the adjutant of Army Group B, who promised his support. The next day the deputy commands at Kassel, Wiesbaden, Hanover, Vienna and Berlin gave almost the same replies. Trained replacements were unavailable. Recovered wounded declared fit for service by the doctors would be dispatched as soon as possible. Paulus was as surprised by this reply as I was. We knew that Germany had no great manpower reserves after the third year of the war, but in the end the 6th Army should have sufficient forces to engage in the main operational goal of 1942. We could expect only a few marching companies from Army Group B. We were grateful for this in view of the impending attack across the Don. Every additional soldier added to the weight, especially if he had combat experience. But we needed more than a few marching companies. The big city on the Volga had to be taken. Street and house-to-house fighting awaited us, which we knew from previous experience demanded heavy casualties. Were our already badly decimated divisions in a position to cope? Paulus looked at me. What do you propose? Permit me, General, to fly to Führer headquarters at Veneza. I consider it necessary to report personally to the head of the organizational section about the 6th Army's personnel situation. Agreed, fly there very early in the morning. You can then be back before dark. I will use the opportunity to speak to the personnel office about officer replacements. Returning to my tent, I packed my papers for the talks in Veneza. Equipped with the latest lists of fighting strengths and officers' posts, I went early next day, shortly after sunrise, to the western exit of Osanovka village where we had established our headquarters. Under the cover of some trees and bushes, camouflaged from the air, stood the Army Staff's courier aircraft. One of them would take me to Charkov. It was already ready to leave. I had hardly climbed aboard when the engine started up. A few minutes later the machine was racing down the steppe. Track and rose from the ground. We flew at a low height. The rising sun was still low in the eastern sky, shedding its light on the endless steppe. The drops of dew on the arid grass glittered like pearls and diamonds. It was a wonderful sight, but there was something rather sinister about it. The wonderful flying weather was not quite without its dangers. It offered enemy fighters several advantages. With clear sight and the sun behind, things could go badly for us in an attack. The pilot could not fail to notice my careful look to the east. But he grinned. Don't worry, Colonel. When our fighters are in the air no rushing yak dare be around. Do you see those sparkling points over towards the sun? They are ours. They will dive down on the enemy like birds of prey should he dare appear. We flew over the route that the army had taken in the last few weeks, but in the opposite direction. Only seldom was a village to be seen. For long stretches we flew over the main road on which convoys laden with supplies were streaming eastwards. The escort teams waved at us. Here and there in the seemingly unending steppe appeared destroyed tanks, guns or abandoned trucks. The trench systems that only shortly before had been occupied by Germans and Russians were clearly seen. Often my eyes fell on the corpse of a fallen Red Army soldier or a horse with its legs grotesquely raised up. Down below thousands of German soldiers and officers had breathed their last, and their loss was the reason for my flight to Veneza. While their stiff bodies were buried by comrades in foreign soil, no one found the time to care for the dead Soviet soldiers in the same way. After making an elegant curve, the pilot set the machine down on the runway. Slowly it rolled up to a Ju-52 standing nearby with its engines running. It was the courier machine to Veneza. Our army headquarters had radioed through from the steppe village to the airport at Charkov. They were waiting for me. I was aboard within 2 minutes. Several couriers had already taken their seats. The engines roared and the machine started off. It quickly gained height. The flight to the west offered a richly varied picture. The fruitful fields of the Ukraine stretched to the horizon, crisscrossed by strips of woodland, rivers, and streams. The network of settlements was considerably thicker here than in the first stage of my journey. Long, stretched-out villages alternated with smaller and larger towns. Our pilot wanted to maintain a height of about 1,000 meters, so we could easily see the transport columns rolling eastwards along the many roads. More conspicuous were the trains steaming towards Charkov, carrying supplies, ammunition, fuel, weapons, and equipment. Charkov was the supply center for Army Group B. Disappointment at Veneza. After just 2 hours we landed without incident at Veneza. A car took me to the personnel office, which was in the town. There I had a long conversation with General von Bergsdorf, the advance to the Don had taken a heavy toll of young infantry officers, but Army Group was unable to fill the gaps. "I understand your concern," said von Bergsdorf, "but at the moment we can hardly help at all. The other units of Army Groups and B also have large requirements. We need several hundred company and battalion commanders alone. Training courses have been underway for several weeks, but apparently will not end until December. Until then I can assure you that we have a full understanding of the 6th Army's situation, but currently it would only be possible to support you at best in individual cases. That is poor consolation, General. Consider again what you can do yourselves within the Army. Check what suitable NCOs you have to put forward for commissioning. Perhaps other possibilities will offer themselves to compensate for the lack of officers in the infantry. I am thinking of certain young Army officials in the rear services. Incidentally, what does it look like with the youngsters in the artillery and the signals detachment? At the moment I have no sufficient overview. But a short while ago the commander of the Army Signals Regiment was complaining to me about his potential officers having no chance of promotion. Once I am back I will have all the signals and artillery units report their potential officer candidates, but not many will stand out. Once I had spoken to the section commanders for Panzer and Engineer officers, I went to see the head of the organizational section, Colonel Muller-Hillebrand. This section was also in the town, not far from the personnel office. Hopefully I would have a bit more luck here. I entered the building with these thoughts. Like everywhere in the Führer headquarters, all passers-by were carefully checked. The duty officer read my pass through at least twice, checking the seal and signature, looking from me to the photograph. Then I was reported to the section leader. "You are coming to me about replacement questions. I know your urgent requirements." Muller-Hillebrand greeted me with these words. I said that he had presumed correctly and placed the latest documents that I had brought with me before him. I described our predicament in detail. Before flying here, I contacted the deputy commands. All replied that worthwhile replacements are not available at the moment. I want to say frankly that we at 6th Army headquarters have the impression that the Homeland departments are underestimating the difficulty of the task facing us. How can we take a big city of about 300 square kilometers with companies of a fighting strength of 30 to 40 men? After our last experience in the Big Don Bend, we can expect the enemy to defend every house, every stone. While I was speaking, the chief of the organizational department was leafing through my papers. I looked at him expectantly. "We know how it looks to you, and you can be assured that I would very much like to help you. Unfortunately, it is really just as the deputy commands at home have said, the newly called up replacements will not complete their training until the end of December. Reinforcing the infantry regiments is not possible before January 1943. I looked at Muller-Hillebrand in shock. The offensive on Stalingrad was due to begin now, not in January 1943. What would then happen if our units were not even up to half strength? The colonel noticed what was going on inside my head. "Tell your commander-in-chief that I will do everything I can to help him. In the coming months we can use some soldiers that have been released as healed from the field hospitals. I will ensure that the marching companies assembled from them will go primarily to the 6th Army. I very much regret that I have not the slightest chance of doing more." I said farewell. In the whole of the war I had never been so downhearted as now, when I had to take the flight back to headquarters. I got to the courier machine to Charkov just in time. It was filled to almost the last seat with couriers, specialists, Wehrmacht officials, and commanders of units returning from leave or training courses. A seat had been reserved for me immediately behind the pilot's cabin. A lively conversation was going on around me, but I hardly heard it. It did not suit me, being the deeply defeated person that I had become after the experiences of this day. Had the Army High Command and Army General Staff really believed that we could advance more than 600 kilometers without suffering considerable losses? Army Group B had not been able to bottle up and destroy the mass of Soviet troops at all. The enemy had been able to withdraw over the Don and would doubtless give us plenty to do in the forthcoming fighting for the big city on the Volga. What kind of war planning was this that set powerful strategic goals but forgot to prepare the timely commitment of men, weapons, and equipment? At every war school it was taught that breaking through a well-constructed enemy defensive position demanded considerable casualties from the attacker if it were to succeed. Already in the First World War the Russians had shown themselves masters of defense. Had they forgotten this at Army High Command? Had not immediate measures been introduced when the first heavy casualty reports from our attacking army were presented? Had we not early enough briefed Hitler's chief adjutant, Major General Schmundt, and Generals Feldjebel and Oshner on the worsening fighting strengths, advised them urgently enough of the threatening situation that must inevitably arise if there were no reinforcements? We had received nothing but words, and nothing was done. More than ever the thought tormented me that the enemy was underestimated by the High Command in an irresponsible way. What would happen if further casualties were incurred in the forthcoming fighting? Were there any divisions on our 1,000-kilometer front that could be drawn upon without the front being torn apart? I had still found no solution when the machine landed at Charkov Airfield, where there was lively activity, with connecting flights standing ready to fly off in various directions. A pilot from our staff was waiting for me. We immediately took off and were in Osanovka by evening. I went straight to General Paulus from the landing ground. His face was strained and fatigued. His formerly erect figure was bent forward. I could see how heavily the burden of responsibility lay on him. "Now Adam, what did you achieve at Führer headquarters?" Without using a lot of words, I reported on the depressing outcome of my flight. I forced myself to control my own anger and disappointment. "So it seems I have to take Stalingrad with fought-out divisions," said Paulus bitterly. As I completed my report, Müller-Hillebrand assured me that the forthcoming March battalions will be allocated in preference to our army. Of course, that is far too few. One has to accept, however, that the Army High Command is concerned with the timely relief of our exhausted divisions if sufficient replacements are unavailable. I myself did not believe in that possibility, but wanted to say something that would not further weigh down the threatening situation. But Paulus did not let it pass. "No, Adam.